they were like, yes. Um, and so I wrote a story about how UNC was using this AI social media monitoring tool to monitor protesters who are protesting Silence Am. But that sort of got me down this rabbit hole thinking, well, if UNC is using this tool for this purpose, I bet a bunch of other colleges are as well. And so I took that idea to Berkeley for graduate school, and then pursued that as my thesis. And so we did the same thing we did at UNC. We filed public records requests at universities all across the country. And we ended up getting about 56,000 pages of documents from all of these schools. And so together with my classmate, Derica Bennett, we just slowly kind of went through all of that material. And eventually we published our stories in the Dallas Morning News. So, like I said, Social Sentinel is an AI social media monitoring tool. It was used by at least 3 dozen colleges, probably a lot more than that, but we were able to verify 3 dozen colleges and hundreds of school districts as well, all across the country. They build themselves as a way to monitor social media to, detect threats of suicides or potential shootings. So the sort of two main claims of our story were that one, the tool is being used to monitor kind of protected First Amendment activity, and two, that it wasn't actually very effective at its core purpose, which was to prevent, detect threats of suicides and shootings. So on that first claim, we found a lot of evidence. We found, of course, the stuff at UNC. We found, after Charlottesville, a bunch of people at Kennesaw State University in Georgia showed up to a town hall to protest against a senator who was speaking, and the university police were monitoring that. They had monitored several other demonstrations with the tool. It was part of the daily job description of one person at that university police department to monitor protests with that tool. We found other protests at various other campuses all across the country that had been monitored. And we actually ended up finding a white paper produced by the company explicitly saying, like, here's how our tool can be effective for protests and demonstrations. So we had a lot of evidence for that first claim. For the second claim, we actually ended up getting a lot of the posts that were flagged by the tool, and we could just read them and see that they were obviously jokes and memes and things that were inconsequential. And they were jokes about hamburger helper being detected as a potential threat of self-harm, or song lyrics or things like that. And so we reviewed those. We also reviewed company emails talking about how great their tool was. We spoke to former employees at the company, things like that. And we felt like we had a good body of evidence to present our story that the tool is just not as effective as they claimed it was. So that is sort of a brief overview of my project. Happy to talk more about things later, but I will pass it off.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Even having read the project here and you talk through like the detail and the number of records you all went through and like the number of schools this is impacting is super incredible. And Hilke, thank you for being here. I want to invite you to share both about your project, and then also I know it connects a lot with the book and your research there too.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And thank you all educators for being here. So, I'm also a journalism professor, so I have a little bit of an older demographic that I service, and I'm also a mom. We can't like thank the world enough for wonderful teachers who show up on a Saturday to learn about AI. So thank you for that. So I started this project actually like 8 years ago when I was taking a Lyft ride from a conference in DC to the train station. The conference had nothing to do with AI, but I got in the back seat and asked the driver how he was doing, and he said, I've had a weird day. And I was like, oh, really? And he was like, yeah, I just got interviewed by a robot for a job. And I was like, what? Interviewed by a robot? I had never heard of this. So there were a couple of other things that happened, but I started digging and sort of build a body of work because I was like really interested. And I was like, wow, this is changing how we hire. So fascinating. And as I started looking deeper and deeper, I found really problematic things. So I talked to a lot of lawyers and other folks who come in when an AI developer develops a tool, and some companies do their due diligence, meaning they bring in lawyers and folks who get a look into the, what we call a black box, because it's unclear. And that worries me about the technology, how even the people that build the technology don't always know how it works, right? So they came in and they looked into resume screeners. So this is when you send in your resume for LinkedIn or a company's website. And, a lot of companies get hundreds, thousands, lots and lots of resumes. So they use AI to screen them. So they looked at like, well, how is it screened? Like, how does this ranking come about of people? And so they found things like first names were some of the predictors of success. So in one case, if your name was Thomas, you got more points. If you had the word African American on your resume, obviously a clear marker of race. You were rated differently than somebody who didn't have those words on their resume. There was instances of potential gender bias. So, for example, if you had the word baseball on your resume, you got more points. If you had the word softball on your resume, you got fewer points. And I should say this was not a position to be a baseball coach. This was like some random non-sport connected job. And I think when I talked to the lawyers, this wasn't like a one thing that they've noticed. A couple were like in every tool that they looked at, they found these problematic, what we call proxies, right? Like, and this is like against like sort of the standard of how we should be doing hiring, right? Because we have moved away from looking at people's gender, like their ethnicity, all of those things, right? It should be about your capabilities and your skills to do the job. And the problem is the way we sometimes build these AI tools, some of these discriminatory proxies can come back in because often it's built on, in this case, the hypothesis is that what happened is probably a company takes everyone who has, says like, oh, here are our successful resumes of the people who are currently in the job. So if this is like, which often happens first, like if this is a tech company, they often have a gender gap. They've hired more men in the past, more white or Asian Americans. And they take all these resumes and tell the tool, hey, what do all these good people, these successful employees have in common? And then new resumes get compared to that. So the tool probably did what it does best. It's a statistical analysis, and it found there were lots of Thomases that were successful at this company. So they got like more points, right? Or folks had different like locations there as well. Canada, Syria, and other places came up that could be discrimination based on national origin. So you see how these problems come in if no one is looking at these tools and really taking a closer look, like what are we actually doing here? And then that to like the second part of the reporting, what came out as well, there's a lot of one-way video interviews. Some of you may have used HireVue or other tools where there's no one on the other side for the job interview, but you were asked, like there's a little video that prompts you to tell them about your strengths and weaknesses or something like that. And you record yourself. Now we have actually generative avatars sometimes doing those interviews. So you get to ask questions and a computer will answer you. People find that a little better than no human on the other side, weirdly enough. But we see that now too. But what we saw in there is what I'd learned from the company speaking to them, and did a whole series for the Wall Street Journal and other outlets on this, is that the tool isn't actually using the recording to score how likely you are to be a high performer or low performer in this job. It uses a transcription tool, which we as journalists use every day, right? You give it the recording and it spits out the text. And I thought about like, this is kind of the plumbing of the internet, or like, of our digital tools. Like, but is it fair to everyone? Does it, quote unquote, obviously it's not a human, but can it interpret the words as well? If I speak them, somebody who has an accent, versus somebody who is maybe a native English speaker or somebody who has an American dialect. And there has been some research that in Echo and Amazon and all these other speakers, people who spoke African American vernacular had over double what we called word error rate. versus white native English speakers. So what we looked at is actually speech disability. Because we hadn't found anything on that. So if you have, like, in this case, it was aphasia, people who often, when they have a stroke, they struggle speaking. So we looked at around 13,000 audio samples of people with aphasia and without aphasia. And to no one's surprise, it turns out that people with a disability are at a disadvantage. But what we also found when we looked at the transcripts, we looked at our graphics, we found out that there was like one little thing, that there were like some of these tools, and one was OpenAI's Whisper, a transcription tool from the ChatGPT folks. And what we saw is that it had these outliers, like 300% word error rate, like almost everything was wrong, right? And we were like, ooh, did we make a mistake? Did we upload the wrong audio? And when we looked at it, we found that it had actually imagined whole slew of text. So instead of like getting my name wrong, which every transcription tool on the planet gets wrong, spelling that, it had actually like added whole new paragraphs that were never in the recording. In fact, there was probably silence on the recording, or just some background noise. And so when we looked at that, we actually found instances of racial bias, ableist bias, and all other things. And no one had reported on it. So I brought this to the AP, and it became a big story because in the United States, thousands and thousands and thousands of physicians, we looked at like healthcare, medical setting in this case, have been using the software. And some of the tools get rid of the underlying recording. So if you're a physician and you get that summary medical note after a conversation with your patient, you cannot check if you actually prescribed this medication, or if there's an error in there. So we thought that was notable, and apparently a lot of medical centers found that notable as well, because they started investigating. So sometimes our work is impact, and I leave it at that. Thank you for being here.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was so like detailed and compact at the same time. I know there's a lot to both these projects, the stories within them. And one thing I appreciate is that if you go to the projects on our website, they both include resources providing insight into how the investigation was done. I know there are educators here in the room today that are likely being asked to consider what it could look like to utilize certain tools in their classroom, certainly transcription tools or other similar things, surveillance tools, right? Watching students tech and what's happening on the laptops. Um, so yeah, I'm curious about what it could look like to evaluate those tools before implementation. If you don't have a full team or time to go through the, 13,000 records, who do you go to? Where do you search? Where do you start? If you're an educator wanting to learn more before you implement.
Yeah, I'm happy. Ari, do you want to go first, or
Yeah.
I'm happy to take this. Ari, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, so I would just have a couple questions to like ask yourself as like a gut check. So you think about a transcription tool, like could a human do this task that the AI is doing, right? Absolutely. For a transcription tool, right? Like I can listen to the audio, and like I used to do this like, 10 years ago, where I would like literally type up what the person told me. So like that's an easy check. Can you check whether it's true? Well, yes, you can listen to the audio. But in Hilke's case, you actually can, because they delete the underlying audio. So I think that's like when you're evaluating tool, you're like, well, is it verifiable, right? What are the consequences if it's wrong? So this is where we get interesting. It's like we have the same tool, but if in Hilke's case, the consequences if it's wrong are actually really bad. They could be, medical errors or things like that. Whereas if the consequence for my otter transcription being wrong is like maybe I misquote somebody, which is bad, but it's not like end of the world bad. Like it's not gonna, like expose me to, like medical malpractice or whatever. What's worse, a false positive or a false negative, right? So if the tool is making a mistake, is it telling you something is true when it isn't true? Or is it telling you something isn't true when it in fact is true? And which of those is worse, right? And sometimes people disagree about which thing is worse, right? Social Sentinel, they didn't make this argument to me explicitly, but I think that they probably would say, well, we just want to show you everything, even if it turns out to be, not important, right? Then you don't want to miss the like needle in the haystack or whatever. They did, in fact, miss the needle in the haystack on several occasions, but we just want to show you everything, even if most of it is bogus. But there were also consequences to, tweet being flagged that didn't end up being threatening. So we wrote about this guy Robbie Robinson who tweeted something, and a SWAT team came to the apartment where he was arrested. He spent several months in jail. He was charged with a felony for something that didn't, he had a mental health issue, but he wasn't actually doing any sort of threat. And so, these things impact real people. And then I would just ask, like, if you're evaluating the tool, like, do you know anything about how that tool was built? Do you know how it was trained? Do you know how it was evaluated? Was it evaluated in the real world? If you don't, then I would suggest you just don't use it, because you can't, you don't have, I mean, you don't have to know the details of, like, reinforcement learning or, all of that, but it's helpful to have some understanding of how the tool is built, how the tool was trained, how it was evaluated.
Totally. I totally agree with that. And I also want to add that I'm a big proponent of testing the tools yourself, if safe. So I'm not trying to say, like, evaluate non-consensual deepfakes technology. Don't do that. But like, if you like come across a tool, so for example, I came across all these hiring tools, right? And it turns out a lot of the companies have like 2 weeks free trial. So before I actually did the speech disability big study with the computer scientists and sociologists, the way I got to this big idea was I had asked the companies beforehand, like, oh, what happens if somebody has a speech disability or they have a dialect or something like that. And there were companies that told me, oh yeah, totally. Like we have like our tools are at totally working with that. And if you're under a certain threshold as a candidate, the hiring manager would get an error message and would get in touch with the candidate. So I was like, huh, I didn't understand what the threshold was because it wasn't very clear to me. But I was like, okay, well, I got my hands on this free trial, right? I signed up with my name and the companies freely give you 2 weeks. So I set up an interview and, I was both the person who did the interview and the recruiter because I set it up in the tool. And so I thought for sure, like, I didn't want to fake a speech disability or something like that. So I was like, let me just talk German because, it's my native language. If I speak German, obviously the tool would be so confused that it would send me an error message, right? Like I wouldn't meet that threshold. So I just answered in German and send it out. And I thought, me as the recruiter would get back an error message, but I actually got like, I was like, I think 75% qualified for the job. And I even got the tool, gave me a transcription of what I said, and it was total gibberish. It was like nematode, does it ira? I mean, it was just wild. And so I was like, this is wild. So I did a bunch more tests with a graduate student who spoke Chinese to the tool. We had somebody else who spoke Vietnamese, same thing. It's all gibberish, and they got really high qualification things. And so we knew we were onto something. Like I was like, if this tool like scores you so highly when you speak gibberish, and I did other things. I said like, I love teamwork. I just said that hundreds of times in an interview, and I also got a really high score. So I knew we were onto something. So I think those kinds of tools actually might give you a signal that these tools may not work, right? Like I want to couch this that it's not like an authoritative results. That's why I got like computer scientists and others involved to work with me on this. But it gave me a signal this can be problematic, and we do this like tryouts all the time ourselves. So the same with I did an investigation for LinkedIn on how women's bodies are sexualized on social media through AI tools that in a like nanosecond decide if you upload a photo or not on social media, if it is should not be uploaded at all because it got scored as porn or gore or violence or something, or if it clears, or if it should be it gets cleared but it gets downgraded. And we found that out because my colleague Gianluca had posted a photo of women in in tube tops, and sort of shown, I was trying to explain something about AI, and there was like an AI like sort of rectangle on the screen, and he was just like, he posted on LinkedIn and he got like almost no engagement. And he's like, this is weird. So he had a hunch that maybe something was going on. And so he posted the same text with a different photo of a female basketball player, and he got his regular engagement numbers. So that then sent us on the hunt. And we found these visual classifiers and again did this whole investigation. But these started from like sort of these little individual like playing with it, right? Like I think I just went to a conference and somebody had played with AI visualized tools and asked them like, what does a journalist look like? And they were all white males that she got again and again and again. So I think those are things that you can even do with students, right? Like how do LLM process our worlds? And I think it will tell you like how much variety or no variety might be in the results that you see.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think for educators who are looking and thinking about this, and one another big question generally is like, if you can't find that information of how do I test this? Has someone else tested it? Um, then I think the question that occurs is like, are my students the test subjects? In which case, like, what does that mean? And where does that data go? And, that's one of my sort of takeaways in the learning and work I've done here. And I'm curious, um, for you, Hilke and Ari, if there have been any new understandings either about AI technologies themselves or about some of the like social political structures that inform them that surfaced during your reporting, and your engagement with the AI Accountability Network.
Yeah, I mean, are the students non-consensual, unknowing test subjects of your AI surveillance tool, right? Like that was the fundamental question that we asked in our project. So I had a couple of things that I thought of for this question, and Hilke was sort of getting at this idea, but like language isn't a fixed thing. There was a funny example that came up for me this morning. That sort of illustrates this idea. So I said I was running with my girlfriend who's British and a friend of ours who's from New Zealand, and I said the word buoy as in like the thing floating in the water, and they just both looked at me, and she's like boy, and I was like, they were like they both laughed at me, and so like two words can sound different. Take the word shoot for example. The word shoot can mean shooting a photo, shooting a basketball, or shooting someone, right? So language is not fixed, like both the way we pronounce things, the way we understand and contextualize things. In fact, so early AI models were not able to distinguish between all the different meanings of the word shoot. So shooting someone was the same as shooting a basketball to the AI model. So that was a big, I mean, I knew that intuitively, right? But, when you're evaluating a tool like this and you're seeing tweets about, shooting stars being flagged as a threat, then that really, goes to show that like these tools are not really as effective as they might claim to be. I think also it really matters like who's using the tool, right? So Social Sentinel was created by these two former campus police chiefs, right? And I think like if you read about these guys and I think they genuinely wanted to do the right thing, but they were selling this tool to campus police, right? And so there's this idea that like does someone with a hammer everything is a nail, right? Like there's this idea that like like police want to like enforce the law, that's what they're literally empowered to do, right? Like their job is not to be a social worker or a mental health professional, right? Like their job is to enforce the law, to arrest people, things like that. And so when you empower them with an AI social media surveillance tool, they're going to use it to arrest people, right? To monitor people. So it really matters like who you're putting, that tool in the hands of. And in this case, because of, who has created the tool and who the tool is being sold to is, in the hands of police. And then I would just say that like these tools are everywhere, right? Like about ChatGPT, but there's all these other tools like Hilke's talking about, like the AI hiring tools. Hilke actually did one of these interviews with an AI bot like 3 weeks ago. so these tools are all over the place. They're in small things like, your grammar checker. They're in big things like ChatGPT. They're, in the background in ways that you don't even like think about or understand. And, our bias can be built into these tools. So you wouldn't even just say that, like, you wouldn't say that the tool itself is biased, but the biases of humans can be built into these tools in really nefarious ways. And those biases can, exacerbate existing inequalities. Like this is the concept of like digital redlining, right? Um, we can have these biases that we have as humans, and then that gets built into the tool, and then the tool distributes that bias at a much larger scale. So you have to be really careful and really diligent about that. When you're evaluating these tools, when you're using these tools, when you think about these tools. So I'll end it there.
Yeah, and I think I think what was interesting to me is like sort of my own evolution, how I thought about this, because I do have to say in 2017, early 2018, I was pretty blown away when I first saw the first video interview and like sort of the screen with like at the time the company was using like facial expression analysis and like had all these rectangles over people's faces and like all these readouts and was like checking for intonation of voices. And I was like, who knew your intonation of your voice and your facial expression in job interviews are predictive of job success? But then I felt like, okay, trust but verify. This is what reporters do. I think many more people in the public should do that, right? Like, let's trust it and let's verify, is this actually true? So when I started talking to experts, they were like, we don't have any science here of facial expressions that are predictive for success on the job. And I was like, what? Why are we using this, and why are we thinking this is predictive? And they're like, well, it's just like correlation versus causation, right? Like sort of this is just the correlation. You can look at, you have the technology, you can look at facial expression. It doesn't mean anything just because you have the same facial expressions, like maybe Ari, who answered the same question and he's successful in the job and I'm a candidate, and now I'm I got more points because of that. It doesn't mean anything. It's a, I'm talking about the job, I'm not even doing the job, and what do facial expressions have to do with this anyway? So I think a lot of critical thinking, like what are the underlying methods even before you use the tool, right? Like is this even fit for purpose? We think a lot about that, right? Like does it actually fit anything, or is it just a hammer that's looking for a nail anywhere and finding weird nails that have actually nothing to do with it? So I did find out overall that this is like not, even though it has a veneer of math and objectivity, right? Like it is not objective at all. And to no one's surprise, we find these same problems again and again. And I do have to say, I'm pretty heartened how I think the public discourse have changed. Like when I show now people the video I did in 2018 about the facial expression, everyone immediately is like, oh, that could be gender bias, that could be racial bias. And I was like, yes, yes, we have totally changed from like the total hype years. I mean, we still live in sort of a hype cycle, right? But like, I think a lot of people have gotten much more skeptical. I think about the one thing I would just caution folks is like, I think you should totally use some of the technology in the classroom. Just think beforehand how you're going to use it, because like in some of the tools that I tried, I used my personal identifiable information in a way that they took my recording. I could like erase that, but I think you want to make sure that like with students, it's always a little different because they can't really consent to some of this, right? Like, so I would think about like, is there personal identifiable information in here? Or could you just query, a chatbot, or could you just do a job interview and show some of these things, right? Like so I think school settings are a little bit different than my personal office. I thought about these things, and I think we need to think about them more, but I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that answered one of the questions that had come up about, yeah, like, should I repeat this? All those questions about, what students can and can't consent to, what maybe parents could consent to. And just part of the reason we're doing this is so that you know that you can have access to reporting and folks who are doing the investigations regularly. So hopefully there's a good mix of both of that, like, yes, in class learning and seeing for themselves limitations of tools, but where that doesn't feel possible, we have AI accountability reporting. Another
Yeah, so some of them
question.
has already been done. You can like use what we have already put out, right? And we have like, I've done videos and podcasts and like fun moments that I think sort of makes it worthwhile to watch and like is a little bit more engaging than just maybe somebody talking at you. And then I do think there's also like really cool instructional technology out there now. There's like LLMs that students can themselves control because they have different, you can choose one corpus or another and sort of understand the limitations of the technology too. So I think those could be really interesting for folks. I know it's like we're flying the plane as we're building it. So I know that a lot of things are flying around the world. And it's hard to gather all this information in your curriculum, but lots of people are working on helping folks.
Yeah. So I have some additional audience questions here. One I think is kind of connected to what you're already speaking to, Hilke, and I invite both you and Ari to share if you have thoughts on it, but it's around, Marilyn says, they have colleagues that use AI to write jobs descriptions, and they're curious about if there's harm in using AI for that purpose rather than the final hiring and why. Or, are there any instances, I guess, of AI assistance um, providing bias? How do you recommend you address the topic of AI within hiring and search committees that they might serve on? So there's multiple questions kind of in
Yeah.
there, but
So I can talk about the hiring questions. I mean, most applicants right now use generative AI to help them with like polishing their resume. Some even use AI to like generative AI to generate cover letters. They use it to, there's like some generative AI tools that actually apply for you. So you don't even do anything. And some recruiters don't like that and they get upset about it. And I usually tell them like, well, you used AI first. So, I mean, you can't really get upset that like now candidates also use AI. And I think it's sort of a numbers game. And to be honest, like no one can really tell if you used AI or not. I mean, like at least in the text part, like the video part, maybe we can see a little bit. But I think to help you polish your resume, I think what's might be even more helpful is there's certain applications like JobScan where you can upload the job description and the resume and see how much overlap there is, and that has helped people. And so search committees, very important. Human hiring, also very biased. So I think the one good thing that like one-way video interviews have brought to this world is like it emphasized what we call structured interviewing, meaning everyone gets to ask the same question. So bias creeps into job interviews when you start asking like, oh, you went to the same school as me? That is so cool. Oh, you know Megan? Oh yeah, she's like my friend. So is Jamil, like, and that creates like the bias because then you don't see somebody like, can they do the job? You see them as like, oh, they're friends with my friends. That's so cool. So I think having the same questions for all the folks is very important. And then having like objective rubrics for scoring to think about like what does get at the skill. And so like job interview questions, I would always we talk about like an action framework where you ask people about how they solved a particular problem on the job, and not quite, like, and this is going to sound a little trite, but like, you're not going to ask somebody like, are you a team worker? In the history of job interviews, no one has answered no to that, but you want to like put out like, when did you have a hard time at the job and how did you solve it with your boss? Can you talk about the whole thing to sort of better understand? And I do think that like for hiring, I do propose a rethink of how we do some of those things. So I think the best assessment, to no prize to anyone, will be the best assessment is getting somebody in the job and seeing if they can do the job. It's not very practical, but can you actually think about assessments that actually go to the 2 or 3 critical skills and capabilities that people need and test for that? Versus sort of people talking about themselves. That's very different than doing the job. So I think those would all be things I would suggest.
thank you. Yeah, I think that's helpful in thinking also for those of you with older students, right? High school age students, helping them evaluate. Like they have different applications they're looking for. You hear about people, I applied to hundreds of jobs and I'm not really getting much back there, but maybe they can be more discreet about where they're applying based on the types of questions that are surfaced or the tools being, knowing upfront this is a waste of my time, basically. They might find that as a useful thing. And I have one more question here for Ari, but also invite you to speak to it, Hilke. Just about if you have any more to share on sort of the why of these tools, right? So the question specifically is one, do you think the monitoring that the AI, I guess this is a social sentinel AI, is doing is tracking more than who was at the protest? Is it continuing to track people after the protest? And why do you think the AI is being used that way?
Yeah, I mean, so you have what the company bills the tool for and what it was actually being used for. All right. And then you actually have a further divide what the company says in public the tool is supposed to be used for and what they give in their white papers to schools, right? Um, and so I think, there was this in fact this tension for the company of, are we creating a tool that is going to protect students from threats, or are we empowering campus police departments to monitor activities, First Amendment type activities, right? I think that was a tension in the company, and so I think that's the fundamental why, and that's why you had some of the issues that you had. um, the way the tool worked is a little bit vague. We had to piece things together from like what they were telling us. We don't know whether they were using the old school. We don't know whether they were using a really rudimentary keyword based system, or they were using the old school AI that couldn't tell the difference between shooting a basketball and shooting someone, or they were using something sophisticated. It probably wasn't the sophisticated thing, at least for the tweets that I was looking at in 2018, 2019, because once again, we were getting tweets about shooting stars and things like that. And just, other companies have tried to address this problem, right? Like Meta has the best engineers in the world, and they had an effort to try to find people who are at risk of harming themselves posting on Facebook. We actually spoke to a guy who had tried to do some of this analysis. But the main difference for him, he worked for like an online therapy company, and he asked people for their entire like tweet history rather than evaluating from one post whether they, were going to commit some sort of self harm. And the difference is he asked, right? He asked them, and then he could see like over time this person was like, saying more things, right? That's not how Social Sentinel works. Social Sentinel would flag a tweet to a campus police department, based on what we think is based on whether it had a certain keyword or a certain sort of intent. And that obviously doesn't work, and then it kind of leads to some other issues. We also know there's a feature that allowed campuses to plug in certain words. So you could plug in words about specific protests. So like you could plug in the word Silent Sam. You could plug, in the case of our Confederate statue, you could plug in, whatever the hashtag that is going around about the protests. All of that is, was within the grasp of the schools. So that takes it from, a tool to prevent shootings and suicides to a tool that is, more targeted at, kind of protected First Amendment activity.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And in your reflection, and even when I was going through the reporting again, this time I was thinking about how, even the most sort of polished tool is going to have a hard time kind of keeping up with the way that language evolves,
Yeah.
especially the way students use it.
Yes. Yeah.
So, there's a new joke or trend or different way of
Yeah.
saying things
Yeah.
every week. So it just
Yeah.
it feels
Well,
like an
yeah.
impossible task in a way.
Yeah. Think about the phrase like no cap. Like you can be capping someone as in shooting someone, but no cap doesn't mean, I'm not shooting someone. It's just like there's all these different ways, like linguistically, like things change. And so, I think asking a tool to keep up with that is like nearly impossible. The other thing, the way that things change is people move on from platform to platform. So we had all these emails to Social Sentinel about like, can you add this platform? Can you add this platform? Because they were like really big on Twitter early on because you had the open API access. So it was like easy to get every tweet. And then, that got cut off. And, so like they would like jump around from platform to platform, but it wasn't really like very monitorable for some of them. And then to be like, oh, can you add yik yak, can you, or whatever it was in like 2017. Yeah, so things like that. Yeah, so you're never going to be able to keep up with linguistic differences. You're never going to be able to keep up with the new platform.
Absolutely. Well, I know it feels like too short of a conversation always, but we are going to close it there. I want to thank you both so much for everything that you have shared. Thank you to those in the chat that have engaged throughout and shared like questions and feedback for our journalist speakers. And we will transition to our next kind of group activity. But yes, thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you for all this amazing engagement, and good luck, and feel free to be in touch. There's only one Hilke Schellmann on LinkedIn, and you'll find my email. So please be in touch if we can be any resource at all.
Yep. Same as I'm just putting my email in the chat here. So if anyone wants to reach out, happy to. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.